Future business success and long-term prosperity will rely on people living well within planetary boundaries. As part of our work on Vision 2050, we partner with experts and drew on international frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, to define what living well really means. It is a world in which everyone's dignity and rights are respected, a world in which basic needs are met, and a world in which equal opportunities are available for all. The concept is underpinned by 5 fundamental foundations. People are free and equal in dignity and rights. There is health and happiness for all. Communities are thriving and connected. No one is left behind. And people have access to a world of opportunities and aspirations. Business has an essential role to play in generating shared prosperity that can be enjoyed by all. The decade ahead is critical and every day counts. Join us and our members in working towards Vision 2050. It is time to transform.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and welcome to our WBCSD Meeting North America 2021. I'm Bill Sisson, Executive Director of North America, and I'll be your host today. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We have an informative 2 hours planned in which we will try and tackle the why, the what, and the how business can accelerate climate action while bringing about a just and inclusive economy. Some minor housekeeping to go through. We are recording today's session, and it'll be available on the Event Hive platform right up until July 23rd to rewatch. And finally, the Event Hive platform itself really offers a tremendous variety of chat, networking, and on-demand content. We want you to get the most value from this 2 hours. So we've prepared a short video that we will show you to walk you through the functionality available to you today. Please take time in the next few minutes to watch and familiarize yourself with the platform. This opening plenary outlines the future we need. I'd venture to say that many companies attending today have a very robust strategy and plan to significantly reduce their environmental impact on the planet. The E in ESG is clearly a priority for many. But by the same token, I'm curious how many of us have spent an equal amount of time trying to determine the role of business, ensuring that this transition to a zero carbon society is also a just transition, one that is inclusive and leaves no one behind. How do we ensure, for example, that the more than 20 million people across the world whose livelihoods depend on carbon-based energy are not displaced, or worse, driven to public support? That question is truly at the heart of this first discussion and frames the conversations for the remainder of this event. I'm delighted to introduce the 2 speakers who will open our plenary discussion today. Peter Bakker, our President and CEO of the WBCSD, and Lynn Forrester the Rothschild, Founding and Managing Partner for Inclusive Capital Partners and Founder and Steering Committee member for the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. We are particularly honored to have Lynn join us today to help us dive deeper into the business and moral imperatives that will need to shape corporate leadership and drive the future we need. Without further ado, please join Lynn and Peter for this opening segment.
Well, good morning, Lynn. We have recently launched Vision 2050, in which we identified 3 pressing global issues: climate emergency, the loss of nature, and inequality. Today, the WBCSD North America team is organizing an event to tackle one not so simple question, I would say. What is needed to ensure that the climate agenda and any climate plans translate into a just and inclusive economic transition. And the question of just and inclusive economic transition goes, in my opinion, beyond creating and transitioning to clean jobs, developing new economic models, or even thinking more about the S and ESG. But I'd be interested, Lynn, what is your perspective on what a just, inclusive economic transition should look like?
Well, first, Peter, thank you so much for the honor of being with you and your colleagues this morning. And WBCSD has been an inspiration to me since I began thinking about inclusive capitalism. You are a 26-year-old organization, and we began thinking about inclusivity after the great financial crisis. But you have been such an important organization, and your members do so much. And so it's an honor to have all of our associations with you. But I'm so glad that you are approaching the sustainability agenda in the same vein as the inclusivity agenda. And that is, of course, now being called the just transition. So part of the Paris Accord, the last paragraph of the Paris Accord, talks about the need for our transition to a clean economy to be just. And that means just to customers, that means just to employees, and just to communities. We can't forget the many workers in the fossil fuel industry who need to be gainfully employed through this transition. And we can't forget communities that have been particularly damaged by the scourge of climate change. So I believe that the just transition is the only transition, in the same way that I believe capitalism cannot survive unless it is inclusive capitalism. So I applaud your members who are thinking about how they take care of the just transition to the cleaner energy.
Well, that's great. And you know, I should have said it at the start. You know, I'm equally proud of the collaboration we have just started with your organization and the push for inclusive capitalism, because one of the elements of Vision 2050 is we need to reinvent capitalism. So that brings me to another topic, and that is really, you know, why should business be a part of addressing inequality? Traditionally, we would probably have said that's the role for governments, but that no longer holds. You know, inequality is one of the most pressing challenges facing our society globally. 3 decades of mounting inequality have brought us now what I believe is a tipping point. We see increasing social unrest everywhere around the world. Big parts of the population are dissatisfied with their circumstances or pessimistic about their future. Social cohesion is breaking down, trust is eroding, and the protest movements are only gaining strength. So, with all your experience thinking through inclusive capitalism, what is your perspective on the business role in addressing inequality?
Well, as business leaders, we know that we cannot have good business in a society that is destroyed. And God did not create the corporation. The corporation was invented by society. And shareholders have limited liabilities, and that gives great leeway to business, but it places great responsibility on business. And business must always focus on maintaining the social contract. And in America, we live in a country where 1% of the people control the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. We have, since 1980, productivity has gone up by 70%, but wages have only increased by 12%, while CEO comp is up hundreds of percent, and the stock market has also increased enormously for those with wealth. Now, that is perhaps not the business of business to worry about it, but it is the business of business to care about the society and the unrest that exists. And so no one is talking about taking shareholder rights away, but joining with shareholder rights, the rights of all stakeholders. So employees and communities and customers all have a stake in our business. So I believe that we have to look at it this way. And I also believe in my role at Inclusive Capital Partners, we invest in companies that are profitably solving the problems of people and planet, because we believe those will become the most valuable companies. That if you look at the value destruction that has happened with the oil and gas industry, rightly so, society has decided that that business model no longer works. So the champions will be the ones who pivot, who transition, particularly those who transition in a just way. And then there will be what I think it was your founder, I think Paul Pullman always talked about as the virtuous cycle, where when the most valuable companies become the companies that are the most sustainable and the most inclusive, then you'll have more and more CEOs and management teams reaching for that. And I think we are really beginning to see that in the climate space, although we have a long way to go.
Yeah, no, I think you're so right. The way we now talk about it is the more sustainable a company, the lower its cost of capital should become. And that, of course, is related to the risks that sustainability and included in that inequality bring to business. You know, we know that climate change poses massive risks on the business models, the supply chain continuity and all that, but also on the communities. Yet, I've noticed that where more and more companies are able to talk about their climate action, even many of the companies are able to talk about nature positive business models, the answers on inequality are often a lot more shy. So one of the things that WBCSD will do is in the coming months, we will launch a new business commission to tackle inequality. And we'll be reaching out to you, actually, if you do not mind, to really get your council involved in that work, to create a joint narrative on what is the role of business in tackling inequality and what are collective actions that we can take. So maybe a question to you is, you know, on the one hand, there's always a moral imperative that people use, but there may also be market imperatives that we need to really include. So how do you think about topics like this?
Well, we cannot focus on the moral imperative without focusing on the market imperative. Because if we are doing the right thing morally, but as business leaders, our businesses are falling behind, then that's not sustainable and it's not scalable. So there always has to be a proper balance between sustainability and inclusivity and profitability. One place I would encourage you to look at what BP is doing. BP has a very forward-looking project in Teesside, up in northern England, where Bernard Looney is retraining his oil and gas experts in the technology of carbon capture. And it is paying off for the company, it's paying off for the community, and I think it will pay off for the world. It's very ahead of its time, but BP is one of those companies that is definitely looking at the just transition. And at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, where we are honored, to be partners with WBCSD, we will be highlighting these best practices of the just transition for oil and energy consumption. And to your question, about the moral imperative, there's a quote from Mario Cuomo, who the Americans will know. He was a New York governor, and he said that candidates campaign in poetry, but they govern in prose. And I feel like as business leaders, where we really do focus on what is our carbon footprint, what is our pathway to net zero, what are our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, we spend a lot of time doing that. And I, for one, trust in the moral core of many of the CEOs doing this. But that's sort of like prose. And the poetry comes when we put it in a moral framework. And I often feel like 2015, which almost feels like a different universe, when in June, Pope Francis wrote the Laudato Si and released it, where he encouraged not only businesses, but all people around the world to listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And then that same year in September, we had the Sustainable Development Goals. In November, we had the launch of what became TCFD. And then in December, we had the Paris Accord, where those signatories acknowledged the need for the just transition. Those were all morally based. To me, that was the poetry. And so I think we have to keep our eye on the poetry and also who we admire in society. We should admire those leaders who can make their companies both profitable but also sustainable. And the best way to admire them is for the asset owners and the asset managers to give those companies a higher PE. And we have seen that happen. There's a company in the United States called AES, which was 85% coal. It was being, pounded by the market. It's very strong earner, but it was about a 9x. And then it turned around, it cleaned up, and now it's 35% coal going to zero. And the PE is 16. So that's an indicator of how the markets can supercharge, and they have to turbocharge the transition. So that's what markets should do to support sustainability and inclusivity.
Great how you link the moral to the market imperative. In many ways, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism and WBCSD share the same vision. We've said we need to move to a world where 9+ billion people all live well within the planetary boundaries in our vision for 2050. We need to develop a compelling narrative for business action around inequality. What would you say to business leaders when it comes to their actions on inequality?
I agree with you. It is a difficult. It is a difficult journey, but I call out both business leaders and governments. I think that we need to have government supporting private industry, giving worker training and apprenticeships. We need to support tax policies that do not only subsidize the purchase of equipment, but subsidize the exercise of employee rights. I believe that boards should be looking at the ratio between CEO and average worker compensation. I believe that boards should look at at the externality they are creating if they are not giving living wages to their workers. I remember when I first started working on inclusive capitalism, another great CEO I had the honor of working with was Mark Bertolini at Aetna. And he was on a tour and he found out that one person wasn't able to come to the meeting because they were collecting their public benefits. And we're a Fortune 500 company. This person works full time and is on public benefits. And he was so outraged that he sent a mandate to his entire management team that he wanted to know what the level of public benefit recipients were in the workforce, and that it was no longer acceptable, that the company had to do whatever was necessary to give people the proper cost. This might be controversial, but I believe that government should charge companies that subsidize their workers through public programs. But I certainly believe that it is a good thing to do what Mark Bertolini did and make sure that anybody working 40 hours a week, it doesn't have to be for a Fortune 500 company. If somebody's working 40 hours a week, they should be able to sustain their lives in a dignified way.
I'm going to have to call you on this business commission to tackle inequality. We need ideas like yours. I could talk for hours with you, but we have to wrap up this session. And I really want to go back to the need for action. As I said, we treat inequality at the same level as we treat the climate emergency or the loss of nature. We need to connect the S with the E of the ESG. We all know that ESG reporting is going to be standardized, will become mandatory. So the real question for today's session is, what is needed to ensure that the climate agenda translates into a just and inclusive economic transition? So Lynn, I'll give it over to you for any closing thoughts you may want to share.
Thank you, Peter. It's a long journey, and it's probably more about the journey than it is the destination. But we all have a role to play. And one reason I am so very honored and thrilled that the Council for Inclusive Capitalism is partners with WBCSD is because what we have focused on doing at the Council is creating a website where companies can agree to the principles that you're talking about, we're talking about, but then make specific commitments. And they can be small commitments toward inclusivity, toward climate change, but they're on the map. And then there will be leaders. And also I can't call it an unintended consequence, but I believe a positive consequence it'll be a place where the world that feels cynical, right? So Peter Drucker said, capitalism is under attack, not because it's inefficient, but because it's cynical. So, and people have a right if they've worked so hard and they're not, but then if they can go to a place and find, whether it's a small company in Dayton, Ohio, or a global company, we have Merck and J&J, nobody's perfect, but if we all try, and if we go on and we make a concrete commitment and we say to the world, I'm going to increase the number of women in my management force by X%, people of color by X%, by what date, it gives people hope. And hope is the opposite of the kind of distress that we talked about at the beginning, which we know is happening in our society. So Peter, it's such a privilege to be with you and all of your colleagues today. And I thank you for everything that you have done personally and that your organization has done. And I really look forward to our partnership on this journey toward a sustainable and an inclusive world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter and Lynn. You did a really nice job of framing the why for our discussion today. You offered us some interesting perspectives that can help us unpack key questions like, what is a just transition and why is it important for business? What is the role of business in tackling inequality? And why business needs to treat inequality and inclusion as equally important as addressing the climate emergency and degrading natural systems, and the commitments company leaders will need to consider. Now we shift to the second part of our plenary today to focus on what will be required for business to ensure a company's long-term sustainability. In WBCSD's Vision 2050, we believe business needs to drive critical systems transformations and leverage key enablers needed for achieving it. We see these enablers as innovation and technology, finance and investment, policy and regulation, and individuals and consumption. Our vision is a world where 9 billion people can live well within planetary boundaries by 2050, as our introductory video outlined for you. In this vision, we are putting people and society at the core of our ambitions. As business accelerates action in Vision's 9 transformation pathways, the enablers are precisely what will allow business across various sectors to contribute towards a transformation that is just and inclusive. What does business need to do to ensure climate action translates into this just and inclusive transition? At the core of transformation is the fact that there needs to be a mindset shift and a recognition that business can act on enablers to shape the transition rather than reacting to them as challenges, and that business needs to be proactive to demonstrate how they will create social, environmental, and financial value. In other words, future-proofing their business. Leading our second plenary discussion today will be Claire O'Neill, a Managing Director of our Climate and Energy Program at WBCSD and member of our senior management team. Claire is going to be joined by Dylan Siegler, the Corporate Social Responsibility Strategist at Verizon, Ed Farrington, the Executive Vice President at Natixis Investment Managers, and James O'Brien, Partner at Baker McKenzie. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. It's so great to be here this afternoon, late afternoon in the UK, lunchtime in the States. And I'm just going to throw in something here, which is I'm so excited to be working with such a fantastic group of US companies. I think you can feel this palpable shift in what's happening in the US space. Companies who may have been on a sustainability journey for a long time, as our panelists have been, now feeling particularly energized by some of the more streamlined policy and more joined up signals that we're getting. So we're super keen at the World Business Council to hear from our existing members, but also to work with you on very many other project areas. And I'm particularly interested and pleased to be leading this discussion today, because I think this framing of dealing with the climate emergency, but thinking very hard about what those actions mean for everybody, but also broadening out the sustainability agenda to consider what it looks like to be people positive, nature positive, as well as climate positive. So I know you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to our great panelists. Just to say a very quick word about the companies that they're representing, because they're a particularly interesting mix. So we have Ed Farrington with us, who was representing Natixis, who are a very big global asset manager. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is when people say, how can we be impactful in making this transition? The power of the financial sector, the power of investments to actually get companies to focus on this and do the right thing, and hopefully reward them with deeper asset pools and a broader cost of capital is absolutely immense. Jim O'Brien from Baker McKenzie, who's been leading the global projects practice groups, who has great global experience. This question of law and policy frameworks, increasingly interesting. And indeed, there was a landmark legal case, not, I'm sure, bought or defended by Baker McKenzie in the Netherlands recently, where Shell was told by a high court that they essentially needed legally to make redress for their climate plans. And last but not least, we have, as we said, Dylan Siegler from Verizon, who have been on a very long journey of embedding technology into their conversation and their processes, a company in a sector, of course, that has extraordinary technological changes to deal with, as well as taking this particular position. So I'm going to start, if I may, with a question to each of our panelists this afternoon, is that it seems that each of your companies has managed to move from framing these changes, these needs, from a threat, if you like, a cost and a threat, into something of an opportunity, a business opportunity. And I think we'd all love to hear more about how that happened and what that actually means for the company. Ed, could I invite you to give us your thoughts on that first, please?
Sure, and Claire, thank you. So we're in a unique position in that as an asset manager who's focused on environmental, social, and governance in our investment process, day to day, we're looking at companies and able to see best practices and see which companies are moving ahead financially. And oftentimes we find those with the best practices around the S in ESG are actually the ones that are performing the best on financial metrics as well. This is also true, and we see this every day with those who are most progressive when it comes to their climate policies. And so with that perch and with that seat at the table that we have, we can then look and turn inward on ourselves and say, are we meeting the same standards that we're holding the companies that we seek to invest in? Are we meeting those same standards? And are we learning from these best practices that we get to view each day? And I will say that increasingly, the evidence is becoming overwhelming that whereas you could look in the past to a potential investor and say, are you hoping to use ESG data to become a better investor? Or are you hoping to use ESG data for impact or to make a better world? And increasingly, I think that question's irrelevant because they're one and the same. And we see data come out day after day after day that shows that the companies that are addressing the social and social, gender, racial justice issues in the most progressive ways are the ones that are outperforming. And there's so many reasons why. We can dive into a bunch of them, but let me say one thing before turning it to back to you, Claire. One thing we know is that when we look at employees of companies and ask them why they stay at a company for a set period of time, we find those who stay at their company the longest, it's not about compensation. It's not even necessarily about benefits packages. They're looking upward in their organization and they're seeing a diverse management team, a diverse board. They're seeing people who look like themselves, and therefore they can begin to imagine themselves having an elongated career. Now think of the implications of that when it comes to how costly it is to train a person to get them into the most effective part of their career as possible. If you can keep them longer, it tends to translate into financial performance. So these are just some of the little issues that we see that we're connecting this idea of better, more just world to better financial performance.
Just before I let you come off this, I mean, you've raised a couple of really interesting points there. It's very reminiscent actually of the debate we used to have in the 90s about gender representation. The idea that these higher performing companies had a higher proportion then of women, and we could never work out if it was causation or correlation, but in a way it doesn't matter because the impact was there. But you said something interesting there, that longevity of your workforce can also be associated with better performance, and so that sense of providing a diverse mix and a diverse set of role models and being very clear that that's part of the company's ethos can also have those beneficial effects.
Absolutely, and I'm sure when Dylan speaks from the pace of change that technology has brought to us, the idea of keeping someone happy and engaged in their job for a longer period of time, it intuitively makes sense that should accrue to the benefit of the company over time. And there's hundreds of examples of this as those who are giving everyone a seat at the table. For instance, they also tend to avoid groupthink. So you have a more diverse set of opinions when a critical decision is being made, and that tends to mitigate or dampen risk. So we could go on and on, but we see this over and over again, that these are not separate issues. The financial and what we see as these S issues are not, they're not mutually exclusive. They're one and the same.
Thank you so much. And Dylan, that might be a great point to bring you in as well, to say, you know, this question of valuing the S and ESG in a very highly dynamic world. Tell us a little bit about how Verizon manages that and how I think you frame it as an opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, I think firstly, I will say, and I related very much to what Ed was bringing up around companies that are addressing social justice in the most progressive ways really are the ones who are outperforming, and we really do hope to be a part of that revolution. Our social impact strategy is critical to our growth strategy. We see social impact innovation as a way to drive growth. We understand that our customers expect it. We're really closely tracking consumer data. One point that my leadership is constantly driving home is that we know that 63% of consumers refuse to buy products and services from companies they don't trust. So this is a way for them to start to trust us. And as Ed was noting, the expectations of investors have really shifted. We know that our top 10 shareholders are really focusing on responsible business practices. They've let us know that. And we have an opportunity there to really show them what that can mean for a company like Verizon. I will also just note that the S in ESG has traditionally in US business over 25, 30 years even been covered off by philanthropy. Mm-hmm. So we see this at Verizon as a question of broadening our social impact focus outward from that traditional philanthropic view to a place where social impact innovation is the key to our everyday work, not only as a social responsibility team that I'm a part of, but as a corporation overall. And this comes down from the top. This is straight from Hans Vestberg to my lips. So, and I will say also, just to clarify, what we mean by social impact innovation is unlocking the opportunity to solve these societal challenges while simultaneously driving business impact. And that could mean driving revenue streams, driving new markets. There's two ways that that's innovative. It's the shift itself is innovative. So shifting to social impact innovation takes innovation inside your business. It's not like a kindergarten concept for our really strong business colleagues. It is a shift to start to think this way. And then beyond that, I will say that Verizon, as a tech and connectivity company, we're deeply interested in pushing the boundaries of technology and connectivity. So we want to combine that focus on tech innovation with social innovation, which we think is a really unique proposition. And so I really look forward to the rest of this conversation.
Dylan, you've given me a lot to unpack, which I'm going to come back to you on a number of points. But before we did that, I wanted to hear from Jim. Again, Jim, you know, you have extraordinary experience in the global sphere on this, and clearly both within Baker McKenzie, but also in your client base. This must be an emerging trend. Tell us a bit about how it's impacting what your company's doing and what your clients are asking for.
Yep, thank you, Claire, and thanks. Those are great comments by everyone. Just a couple of thoughts on it. In maybe first taking it back to our own organization and how we think about it, I suppose, is we think about it in part as the health and well-being of our lawyers, our staff, and the folks that we work with. And if there's one thing I think the pandemic demonstrated, in many tragic ways, of course, but at least as we think about it, is the influence of those things goes much beyond what we thought it did. So that the effect on many others, well beyond the roughly 17,000 people in our organization, actually comes back home and affects what we do. And so the health and well-being of all of those people that affect what we do is an important thing. And in a way, I guess we kind of think of it as bringing externalities back in as internal costs to the organization. And probably one of the best examples for those who are in the United States is what happened in Texas in February, where the storm knocked out all the power. And so that externality in the past that we'd sort of shifted out to others, all of a sudden comes home to roost. So our lawyers are on the phone charging their phones in the car in order to be able to conduct the business. So as we think about it for our own organization, it's important for the health and well-being of our employees. The second thing, just quickly, is how do we think others have seen it? Of course, we'll talk about it further, but we're seeing such a strong move towards decarbonization in everyone's business, just as a way of anticipating the needs to be able to do business in the future. And at least in terms of opportunities for us, it creates opportunities where companies like Dillon's, for example, will go out and independently buy renewable energy from power developers in order to be able to actually provide renewable energy in their supply chain. And so there's many examples like that you can point to and say it really does create opportunities.
It doesn't, and thank you for raising that. Before we move on, I just wanted to ask your advice on the sort of policy and regulatory enablers, if you like, because one of the sort of interplays that we all have to deal with is obviously our corporate ambition, how we work collectively, and obviously that's the role of WBCSD, but how much we're responding or working with these enablers of the transition. And you know, people say, why isn't there a global carbon price, or why isn't there some law about carbon? Well, guess what? Here's some news. There is never going to be one, but we might have some much stronger regulatory frameworks that emerge. But James, when it comes to policy and regulation, how much is your company and your clients looking to that to drive the changes, as opposed to, I guess, looking inwards to themselves and saying, yes, that's the policy landscape, but what do we need to do differently?
Probably 2 points on that, Claire. One is that there are clearly obstacles that are in the current regulatory structure to doing the things that we want to do with our business, for example, to decarbonize. So take the instance in which a company actually contracts directly for power from renewable energy. There are restrictions in the regulatory scheme that prevent that company from buying power directly from the plant. So we kind of go through a process of constructing a whole structure in order to be able to do that. But ultimately, it creates a barrier to actually doing the things companies, I think, want to do in order to be able to decarbonize. The second thing, I think, is that I point to it more just in the sense of, I suppose, business practices, and that is, some of it isn't necessarily driven so much by policy and regulation that's applicable to the particular company, but rather to the company that is its customers. So, for example, Caterpillar recently announced a transaction with a Canadian miner in which Caterpillar will supply the large trucks that you see and you think of as mining trucks, you know, the size of houses. And they're going to supply trucks by, I think it's 2030, that are zero emission trucks. And that's not driven necessarily by the policy and regulation that affects Caterpillar, but it does affect its customers. And so I think a second way in which we can see policy and regulation affect what our businesses do will be how their customers are treated and the things that they're going to have to do.
Thank you for that. And of course, you will forgive me for making a plug for some of the great joined up working my team had done in the PPA, the power purchase agreement areas, where collectively through WBCSD, we basically persuaded about 40 companies to both shift their own purchasing behavior, but also really added value in terms of the contractual structure and some of the policy framework, and that's the power of collective action. But if I can just come back a little bit on this question of these enablers, because, you know, when I was at business school in the States many years ago, and where, you know, regulation was bad, boo, we hate the government, they're just here to take away our profits. And arguably that would be the view also of certain CFOs when they're thinking about their lenders and investors. This is all bad stuff that's getting in our way. Do you think that's changing, that actually now this role of policy and financial reporting and indeed innovation is now being treated as a positive rather than just something that we just have to deal with and quietly lobby against? Ed, what would be your view on that? And also, Ed, you've had a lot of experience, I know, with Fidelity and other places globally, so you will have seen this develop like me over several years.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me give a kind of a living example right now that we're experiencing. So the Department of Labor is the regulator on behalf of the retirement system in the US. So $10 trillion of capital that is invested through workplace savings plans. And the Department of Labor sets forth the rules and gives indication of what's right and wrong for a plan sponsor to do when choosing investments on behalf of their participants. And what we've seen over the past, let's call it 15 years, is a little bit of a political football on the topic of environmental, social, and governance in the investment framework. And as you can guess, when you'd have a more progressive administration, it would lean toward or be slightly in favor of incorporating ESG. And when you had a more conservative, it would tilt slightly against. This got very much accentuated during the last administration. And there were clear signals from the department that people who were, or plan sponsors who were considering incorporating ESG should do so almost at their own peril. While the law that, or the rule that came out did not say you couldn't invest in ESG, it certainly gave a signal that it was something to be cautious about. Well, we're watching that change dramatically as we speak, dramatically. And what we know from both a non-enforcement decree on that policy, and then from an executive order from President Biden that has said we want to reconsider this rule, and we want to start to recognize the data that shows that these environmental, social, and governance issues are financial issues, that if we rebranded them to 21st century business risks, then everyone would want to manage them or put them in a business plan. And we're finally seeing that thaw. And I think you could see a material shift in the marketplace, because as we sit here today, less than 1% of that $10 trillion in capital is invested in some type of responsible or sustainable investment strategy. That's not the natural market share of ESG in defined contribution plans. It's probably closer to 20, 25%, right? So this is trillions of dollars of capital that can move and support these companies that are the most progressive and outperforming over time because of that approach to these issues. Companies that are thriving don't see these as something to be afraid of. They see them as opportunities.
Exactly. Thank you. And Dylan, again, you've got great experience in this space. I mean, this sense now of these enablers are an opportunity. They're a chance to show what good looks like rather than something to be resisted. Is that very much the mindset now in Verizon?
That's absolutely true, Claire. And I think your initial statement that we used to look at regulation as universally bad has really shifted. My team in the corporate social responsibility space works hand in glove with our policy team. And so we really see working across, and Verizon is an international company, but our consumer business is focused on the US. We really look at how to work across both the federal government and the state and local regulatory landscape to make what we want to happen. But there's other enablers. And so we look not only at those who are kind of calling the shots from the top, but really we've started to look at, and I've made this analogy to Bill, I believe, we look at Verizon kind of as an aircraft carrier where we're launching a lot of little planes off every day. And if we can resource these little players, startups, innovators, others in the innovation space to kind of be out there seeding this work for us while we shift the big aircraft carrier, we're going to get there faster. And so we can be we're in the big mothership doing that really transformative work and using our influence, we hope, for good, aligning our influence with what we want to achieve in terms of systemic outcomes. So it has to come from both sides.
I love that analogy. I love the idea of the mothership and the little ships, the little boats heading off, or planes rather. And it's actually very much in WBCSD, this sense of a flywheel, that if you can get the world's most ambitious companies working together, the opportunity to spin the gear of customer behavior or supply chain decarbonization or working practices or lobbying or policy, it's incredibly impactful. And in a world where policy is really important, but global policy signals are very hard to come by, I think this global power actually that companies have is quite extraordinary. I wanted to switch gears, if I may, which is, I think one of the things that's fascinating is what drove this in your companies. Did the CEO wake up one morning and they just got it? Or was it investor pressure, or was it a contractual situation? Well, what's changed it within your company? What made the shift? James, tell us what changed it in Baker McKenzie.
Clearly, thanks. Clearly driven by our clients, because they're shifting the way that they do their business, and we need to keep up with them. And I think the way we think our clients see it really is in probably from the perspective of their board. And at least the board seems to be thinking about it from the way of, well, how do we think about the structure of this issue, both the risks that are there and the opportunities we need to manage? How do we measure it? And then how do we create accountability around it? Those sort of three things drive, I think, what our clients are doing. And so on our side, we looked at that same thing and said, you know, we really need to think about it the same way. What's the structure in which we need to think about it? Well, the structure, of course, is the way in which our clients are going and the business that they carry on. So we need to do the same thing. How do we measure it? Well, in our instance, we committed to reduce our carbon emissions by 92% by 2030. And we created accountability around it by appointing a chief sustainability officer, actually was an equity partner at the firm, because of course, lawyers never listen to anybody else unless they're another lawyer. You know, there's a social inhibition about that. So we made sure that we had somebody with the right authority in order to be able to do so. So what changed us was that thinking from our clients, and we applied it to our own organization in order to be able to take it forward.
Thank you. Ed, what was the shift? What was the shift in your firm?
Yeah, so I think it's a recognition that the world is undergoing these significant transitions. And you can either, as a company or an investor, you can either see those at, or with the appropriate policies, those can be tailwinds, or with the wrong policies, they can be headwinds. And we just think it makes sense to have tailwinds, not headwinds, when we think about the evolution of our company or the way we deploy capital each day. So it's very much evidence-based. I'll say this, there's another big part of this that's hard to quantify. It's just a general sense that of doing the right thing, of wanting to help create the world that we all want to live in. And that is a major part of this. And then the evidence backs up the decision as being a good one.
So it's having the courage, if you like, to as you say, you can't always prove the causality, but it's that sense that you are part of a system and you want to do better. And I find that runs much hotter in the private sector at the moment than in many governments, which is why it's so exciting to be part of this collective group. Dylan, was there a eureka moment for your organization?
You know, the direction was set by the CEO, but I know that it was informed by a global view of the intersectional challenges that we're facing societally. It's also, I will say, informed by a growth mindset for the company. And we really see these two pieces of social impact innovation as being inextricable from growing Verizon as a company, making sure that we have the customer base that we need to succeed. Because it's circular, we can't be a global player. We can't make these big societal changes that we think are possible if we don't succeed as a company. If Verizon doesn't exist, we can't play on the global stage. So when we look at, for instance, how to advance digital inclusion across access to digital tools, affordability of those tools, application of the internet to improve your lives, we seek opportunities to really grow Verizon's influence within all of those spaces, whether in a policy sphere or in a sales sphere, because we can do both of these things at the same time. And if we weren't here, we would have no influence at all. So
I love that. Yeah, I love the fact that you want to grow, that growth and doing the right thing and positive returns are inextricably linked. And as you say, if you're not there, you can't change the world. But we're running out of time. I could talk to you, listen to you guys all afternoon, but sorry, I shouldn't say guys, the panel all afternoon. I've learned that that's bad. That's a hangover also from my days working on Wall Street in the 1990s. Apologies. But I wanted to perhaps challenge a little bit, which is there are those out there who would think, oh, this is just a load of corporate greenwash. You know, they'll have looked at the Exxon, the horrific Exxon lobbying. They'll say these companies are saying the right thing when they're with the World Business Council, but you know they secretly don't get it. How could you demonstrate that this is authentic in your organization, that this is not just the nice to-dos with the well-spoken people presenting it? It actually runs through your DNA. Ed, what would you say to those challengers, that this is all just greenwash?
So last summer was a pretty amazing moment for the world, certainly for the US. And I think it forced to the front companies' policies around diversity, equity, and inclusion, including our own. And we looked inward and again, felt very comfortable at that moment in time with where we had been, but it wasn't good enough. And we set forth very clear metrics for our clients to hold us accountable to, that we believe we need to look like the city of Boston, where we're headquartered in the US. And right now, demographically, we don't. We have work to do when it comes to racial and when it comes to gender equity. We have work to do. And by putting those metrics out and saying by 2024, we will reflect the city of Boston, and we will look like the city that we live in and the customers that we serve, it forces us to hold ourselves accountable and begin to put policies in place that allow us to go on that march. So to me, it's very transparent what we've made a decision to do, and therefore you can measure it. And I do think measurement is a very important part of this. And I think more companies like the great ones that are on this panel today are very willing to say that and to be held accountable themselves for these policies and these statements.
Thank you. James, how to convince us this isn't greenwash?
Yeah, well, two things, a good point, and always a concern. One is we agree with Ed on measurement. We've committed to 40-40-20 in the partners and leadership of our firm, 40% men, 40% women, and 20% either men, women, or those that don't identify as either. And we hold ourselves accountable to that by how we promote, so that if you haven't reached those kinds of targets, it becomes more and more difficult in your particular piece of the organization to go forward. So we do think that that's a good way to do it. The second thing I'll just note is, certainly like everyone else, we have clients and we have customers, and our customers look at us and say, look, you're handling for us some very important things. We want the best talent, experience, and expertise in order to be able to do that. If you put forward a team that doesn't look like the rest of the world, you're really not putting forward a team with the right talent, experience, and expertise. So it's not as if we're trying to pick out of the air, say, well, we need this or that or something else. What we're really trying to say is the only way you can, I think, credibly say that what we're doing for you is being done by the best people available is to reflect the society in which we live. And that is a group of folks with the right talent, experience, and expertise. And so that drives us as well, is how our clients.
Thank you. Thank you, inspiring. Dylan, the last word on this. So I'm a gnarly, I'm my daughter who goes and regularly protests in the UK and blocks roads and things. Convince me that you're serious about this. This isn't just another way to make a buck.
Yeah, it's a fair question, Claire. And I think, the proof is in the pudding. Look to the innovative products and services that Verizon will be putting into the world. Observe the way that those products and services solve real world problems for populations that have challenges or have experienced systemic marginalization. Judge our social performance in this area on the results that we create for people we aim to serve.
Brilliant. I mean, this is such an inspiring conversation, and really huge congratulations to all three of us. We didn't get onto it, but my sense is that companies in the USA and in the whole North American continent are actually well ahead of the global pack in really focusing on the S and ESG. So it's fantastic to hear that. And I took away some clear messages, make policy your friend at different levels, constantly think about how you innovate and grow in the market and make that a force for good. Focus on that sustainable finance as a lever, educate your consumers and your supply chain, they're part of the journey. But above all that sense that all three of you really conveyed of, judge us, we've set our targets, we're going to deliver them, we want to be completely transparent, and you can judge us on our results. And you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So thank you so much for being really clear and really inspiring about what you're doing. It was fantastic to listen to you. Thank you. Bill, back to you.
Thank you, Claire and Dylan, Ed, and Jim, for really making some wonderful contributions that I'm sure our attendees will take to heart. This really was about future-proofing and the conversation that businesses are starting to have around these issues. But after listening to these two plenary discussions, it just seems to me we're just beginning to break through the surface on the why and the what business will need to do in ensuring a just and inclusive transition towards what we think is our WBCSD's vision and a net zero economy. So we have to think carefully about the role companies need to play in considering the impact of their climate actions on society. It's the hidden or not so hidden social consequences that we need to be careful to deal with. Technology gives rise to the question of reskilling a not yet in place workforce, or not displacing an existing service sector that may be tied to it. Impactful policies gives us a sense of how we leave no one behind and create an empowered, diverse, equitable, and inclusive community of participants, and the implications for supportive business regulations. And finance and investment offers insights into the materiality of the data requirements companies will need to consider that drive the financial rewards they're looking for. Maybe the cost of capital or the investor confidence comes forward in a much greater way, like we heard from Ed. And these will benefit the leaders and disadvantage the laggards. A striking example of this is the IEA's expected 5 million fossil fuel industry jobs that will be displaced by 2030 in the clean energy transition. Whose responsibility is it to address that displacement? And within this transition, we also need to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the company's strategy. I was reminded of a recent podcast I had with Yusuf George from Just Capital. For those less familiar, Just Capital is a nonprofit in the US that tracks and analyzes how well top companies are performing on inclusive stakeholder capitalism metrics. Yusuf told me that at the current rate, it will take companies 95 years for Black Americans to achieve racial parity across the private sector in the US. 95 years. Clearly, we have some work to do here. And WBCSD's announcement today to stand up the Business Commission for Tackling Inequality that Peter mentioned in his opening remarks will certainly be focused on those challenges. As we wrap up today's plenary, it now shifts to you to take part during the breakout sessions that we've planned, where we ask you to lend your thoughts in one of our 2 parallel discussions that will ideally break all this down into the how we can achieve the needed climate action while resulting in a just transition. You'll see that we've taken a more integrated approach to the enablers in each of these 2 sessions, one on policy, the other on innovation, but grounded by finance. So start to consider where you'd like to bring your thoughts, ideas, and voices into those discussions. After the next short video, there will be a short transition period for you to decide which of the 2 breakout sessions you'd like to attend, and maybe to have a quick private chat with someone you've been meaning to speak to along the way. We'll connect again at 40 past the hour to start the breakout discussions, and thank you and see you shortly in these groups. And if not, we'll be back again to do this next year.
Future business success and long-term prosperity will rely on people living well within planetary boundaries.
As part of our work on Vision 2050, we have drawn on the latest science and a broad range of expert input to define what living well within planetary boundaries really means.
It's a world in which global warming is stabilized at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and nature is protected, restored, and used sustainably. And where societies have developed sufficient adaptive capacity to build and maintain resilience in a healthy and regenerative Earth system.
But making these changes will require sustained effort across a number of areas, including reaching net zero emissions by mid-century and making clean air available to everyone, protecting and restoring the biosphere, oceans, and cryosphere,
ensuring that land, oceans, waterways, and coastlines are free from waste and pollution, consuming natural resources sustainably, and truly valuing nature.
Business has a critical role to play in driving these positive changes in all of these areas, helping to ensure that businesses have thriving communities to trade with and a healthy planet to exist on.
The decade ahead is critical, and every day counts. Join us and our members in working towards Vision 2050.
It's time to transform.